Welcome to Cheap Talk, the podcast where we dive deep into life's little dilemmas. Today we're tackling something many of us struggle with, especially in our hyper-connected world: overthinking.
Oh, overthinking. That constant mental loop that can really tie you in knots, right? The article we're discussing today starts with someone feeling slighted because their boss wasn't liking their social media posts.
Exactly. And it's so relatable. It's that feeling of being left out, or worse, being intentionally ignored. It's like, why isn't my boss acknowledging me online? Is it something I did?
Yeah, and then the friend's response, "You're overthinking it," just adds insult to injury. Because haven't we all been there? Planning every detail of a trip only to be labeled a control freak? Carefully wording a text just to second guess everything before hitting send? It's exhausting.
It really is. The article calls it overthinking, but gives it a more clinical term: overroot, or constant unproductive thought loops.
Right. It highlights the difference between productive thinking, which leads to action, and overthinking, which paralyzes you with what ifs.
Totally. Like prepping for a storm. Thinking means securing your home, getting supplies. Overthinking? Spiraling into a panic about every possible worst-case scenario and getting nothing done.
And it's often tied to heightened self-awareness, right? Constantly monitoring yourself in social situations, trying to anticipate every reaction. It's like walking on eggshells all the time.
Yeah. The article suggests this often stems from a need for self-preservation, maybe from past experiences where you had to manage someone's volatile reactions, so you develop this hypersensitivity as a defense mechanism.
It makes sense. It's like you're always on high alert, scanning for potential threats, even if they're not really there. And this can lead to a focus on being right in social interactions rather than on genuine connection.
Absolutely. And that's where the trouble really starts. Overthinking can fuel anxiety, disrupt sleep, and sabotage relationships. It's a vicious cycle.
The article lists 8 signs of overthinking, like constant worry, inability to relax, and always assuming the worst. It can even lead to rumination and analysis paralysis.
Oh, for sure. And it can really mess with your communication. You're so busy analyzing everything that you lose focus, misinterpret cues, and end up creating more misunderstandings.
It's like you're so in your head, you're not even present in the conversation. The article mentions that this can lead to projecting your insecurities and anxieties onto others.
Exactly. And Dr. Bonnie Talbert from Harvard points out, even if you figure out the right answer in your head, it doesn't necessarily help resolve conflict. It can actually make things worse.
Makes sense. It can dig you deeper into your own perspective, creating more distance between you and the other person. Relationships are dynamic. You have to actually engage to understand someone, not just overanalyze in your own head.
The article then shifts gears, suggesting that it's not about being right, but about overcoming the fear of being wrong, or rejected, or hurt.
Yeah, the anecdote about the woman reconnecting with her friends is powerful. She was so afraid of being judged or rejected that she isolated herself until her therapist challenged her to just reach out.
Right? It's a reminder that sometimes the hardest part is simply taking action, even if it feels scary. And more often than not, the outcome is much better than we anticipate.
It's about shifting the focus from endlessly analyzing others to understanding your own feelings and needs. As the article beautifully puts it, there are only 3 things in this world: my business, other people's business, and God's business. You can only control one of those.
So picking up on that idea of action, right? It's like you can analyze a situation to death, but until you actually do something, you're stuck in that overthinking loop. This reminds me of something I read by Chu, Chang, and Abdullah.
Oh yeah? What'd they say?
Well, they talked about this constant unproductive thought loop they called overyear, which basically translates to, well, you guessed it, overthinking. And they really emphasized the difference between productive thinking and this kind of like mental hamster wheel.
Totally. Like, planning is good, analyzing is good, but at some point you gotta jump. Otherwise you're just spinning your wheels, like you said.
Exactly. And this whole self-awareness thing, Cheek and Briggs back in '82, were already digging into this idea of self-consciousness and how it ties into identity.
Oh, interesting. So, like, the more self-aware you are, the more prone you might be to overthinking?
It seems that way. And Morin, in 2002, asked this really key question: are you self-reflecting or are you self-ruminating? Huge difference, right?
Huge. One moves you forward, the other keeps you stuck. Like reflecting on a past experience to learn from it? Helpful. Obsessing over it and beating yourself up? Not so much.
Right. And that's where this can get really problematic. Talbert in 2017 called it analysis paralysis. Like you're so busy overthinking, you can't actually make a decision.
Makes total sense. You're so caught up in the what ifs, you're frozen. It's like that old saying, perfect is the enemy of good.
Ooh, I like that. And get this, even if you do manage to think your way to what you believe is the right answer, Talbert points out that it doesn't necessarily resolve the conflict.
Right, because relationships aren't equations. You can't just plug in variables and solve for X. It's messy, it's dynamic. You have to be present, not just in your head.
Totally. It's like Nolan Hoeksema's work on rumination also plays into this, right? This tendency to get stuck in negative thought patterns.
Oh, for sure. It's a vicious cycle, and it can really impact your relationships. Like the article said, you end up projecting your insecurities, misinterpreting cues. It's a recipe for disaster.
So it's not just about being stuck in your head, right? This overthinking thing can have some serious consequences, like, for your mental well-being.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we touched on anxiety, disrupted sleep, but it goes even deeper, right? Like into actual clinical depression.
Exactly. I was just reading Nolan Hoeksema's work, specifically on rumination. And wow, the connection to depressive disorders is stark.
Yeah? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's this like vicious cycle. Rumination, that's the tendency to chew on negative thoughts, replaying them over and over. It's a major player in depression and mixed anxiety/depressive symptoms too.
So it's not just overthinking in general, but a specific kind of overthinking that's particularly harmful?
Precisely. Like planning a trip is one thing. Obsessing over a past mistake and beating yourself up about it, that's rumination. And that's where the real trouble starts.
Right, right. It's like getting stuck in quicksand. The more you struggle, the deeper you sink. And it's not just Nolan Hexema, right? Other researchers have looked at this too.
Oh yeah, for sure. McLaughlin, Borkovac, and Sabrava, back in 2007, they dug into how worry and rumination affect mood and how we think.
So, like, the more you worry and ruminate, the worse you feel and the harder it is to think clearly?
Exactly. And then Merck Segerstrong and their team, their research in 2000 showed how these repetitive negative thoughts, they can actually predict negative moods.
Wow. So it's not just a symptom, but a precursor, like the overthinking actually sets the stage for the low mood?
Seems that way. It's like creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. You worry, you ruminate, you feel worse, and then you worry and ruminate even more. It's a mess.
Totally. And Sperber, in their work on overthinking, breaks down the definition, the causes, and importantly, how to stop this cycle.
Well, that's key, because knowing it's a problem is one thing, but having strategies to actually deal with it, that's what really matters. What does Sperber suggest?
Well, we'll get into the specifics later, but it's a lot about mindfulness, challenging negative thoughts, and focusing on the present moment. Kind of like what we were talking about earlier with shifting the focus from other people's business to your own.
So this whole overthinking thing, right? It's not just about, second guessing your texts. This can have some serious consequences for sleep.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we all know that stress and anxiety can mess with your sleep, but this goes even deeper. It's about the types of thinking that keep us up at night.
Exactly. I was just reading this research on sleep disturbance, and it really highlights the role of rumination and worry.
Yeah? Tell me more about that.
Well, it's like, how you can lie in bed, just replaying conversations, analyzing every little detail, wondering what you should have said differently?
Oh, yeah, totally. Or stressing about things that might happen tomorrow, next week, next year.
Exactly. That's the stuff that really fuels sleep problems. The article calls it repetitive thought, and it breaks it down into two main categories, rumination and worry.
So rumination is the rehashing past events, and worry is about future events? Is that the distinction?
Precisely. And both can be incredibly disruptive to sleep.
Makes sense. It's like your brain just won't shut off. You're either stuck in the past or anxious about the future, and you can't find that peaceful present moment. You need to drift off.
Right. And the research shows that these repetitive thought patterns, they're linked to all sorts of sleep issues, like difficulty falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, and even nightmares.
Oh, wow. Nightmares too? That's interesting. It's like your anxieties are manifesting even in your dreams.
Yeah. And get this, the link between overthinking and sleep problems, it's not just a one-way street.
Oh? What do you mean?
Well, it turned out that poor sleep can actually increase your tendency to ruminate and worry.
So it's like a vicious cycle? You can't sleep because you're overthinking, and then the lack of sleep makes you overthink even more?
Exactly. It's a real trap. And it can be hard to break free without some specific strategies.
Like what kind of strategies?
Well, things like mindfulness exercises, cognitive behavioral therapy, and even just making sure you have a regular sleep schedule. Those can all help. Hmm.
That makes sense. It's about quieting the mental chatter and creating a more conducive environment for sleep, both internally and externally. So, connecting this back to the beginning of our chat, this overthinking, overjoel, as the article mentions, is the first step down that slippery slope to repetitive thought.
Exactly. It's all connected. The overthinking fuels the worry and rumination, which disrupts your sleep, and the lack of sleep just exacerbates the overthinking. And bringing in some of the earlier points, self consciousness, as Crozier and Russell explored, plays a significant role here too, doesn't it? It's that heightened awareness of oneself and others' perceptions that feeds the overthinking cycle. You're constantly scrutinizing your actions and interactions, looking for validation or fearing judgment.
Oh, absolutely. And as mentioned earlier, that constant self monitoring can become exhausting and really mess with your sense of self worth and ultimately leading to sleep disturbances and impacting your relationships.
And that's where those KY resources, the articles, the psychological services can be incredibly helpful, right? They offer practical tools and guidance to manage these thought patterns and break free from that overthinking trap. And as they remind us, it's not about ignoring our feelings or pretending everything is perfect. It's about finding healthy ways to process them, to manage our inner critic, and to build stronger, more fulfilling connections with ourselves and others.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we all have those moments of overthinking, those what ifs and should haves, but we don't have to let them control us. And with that, we've come to the end of another episode of Cheap Talk. Thanks for joining us. And remember, it's your life, your thoughts, your journey. Take control, and we'll see you next time.